Welcome to episode number 36 of the Pernicious Chattel channel. I don't know about you, but my horrifying fascination with the invasion of Ukraine has also driven me to consider the big questions. How and why does Europe find itself in this situation again? Sure, the Second World War was more than 75 years ago, but the lessons haven't been forgotten. The shape of Europe, the political structure, the alliances, and even the cultures of the continent are all shaped by the last major European war. Everyone agrees that we don't want it to happen again. Yet, Russian troops, tanks, and airplanes are reducing Ukraine to rubble. It all seems so hopeless and inevitable. Once again, Europe has millions of displaced people on the move. Once again, allies are trying to dissuade a violent dictator and at the same time avoid escalation. Of course, there are many great background videos and books about this conflict. We don't lack for information. The build-up to this war was well understood. A resort to extreme violence isn't surprising to anyone who knows anything about Putin and his ass-kissers. We understand the nuclear threat that makes our response so verbally forceful and otherwise restrained. People know the history, the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of Putin. Putin and his cronies are criminals and thugs. Absolute shit. Meanwhile, the West felt influence and pride was more important than peace. Yet, I still remain disturbed with these answers. This conflict is not one anyone wanted. Everyone understands that modern warfare is destructive to what we value. Western Europe doesn't want instability and refugees. Putin wants a wealthy, powerful Ukraine that will do what he tells it to. In the end, no one will win, and there will be huge losses. So the question remains, how and why are we seeing this happen again? Is the human species always going to remain so violent? Are we always going to see the need to kill one another in large numbers? Is war an unavoidable necessity? That's today's topic. Demonic Males, Apes and the Origins of Human Violence is a 1997 book by Richard Wrangham and Dale Peterson examining the evolutionary factors leading to human violence. This is a book that has a lot to say about the human tendency to warfare and, as a result, provides some interesting insights into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. From his faculty page, Richard Wrangham, PhD, Cambridge University, 1975, is Ruth B. Moore Research Professor of Biological Anthropology, retired, at Harvard University, and founded the Kibale Chimpanzee Project in 1987. He has conducted extensive research on primate ecology, nutrition, and social behavior. He is best known for his work on the evolution of human warfare, described in the book Demonic Males, and on the role of cooking in human evolution, described in the book Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human. Together with Elizabeth Ross, he co-founded the Cassisi Project in 1997 and serves as a patron of the Great Ape Survival Partnership, GRASP. Dale Peterson is an American writer with a PhD in English literature from Stanford University. He has written many books on various subjects, but with a focus on the sciences and natural history. He is well known for his collaboration with Jane Goodall on the ethics of using chimpanzees in research. To quote from his Wikipedia page, Peterson co-authored the classic evolutionary study of human violence, Demonic Males, Apes and the Origin of Human Violence, which has been translated into 9 foreign languages and honored by the Village Voice as Best of the Year. This book, I suspect, might be a challenging read for ideological readers. It strongly asserts that aggression and violence in humans is an inherent trait. It quite forcefully rejects the notion, popular in some left-wing movements, that violence is simply a result of patriarchy, and therefore a socially constructed phenomenon. It rejects any belief that human beings in nature are peaceful. In fact, the book provides a great deal of evidence to thoroughly convince a reader. For instance, data on hunter-gatherer societies reveals that 64% engage in warfare regularly, 25% often, and only 10% rarely or never. Based on the best available facts, life in primitive societies, primitive being their word, not mine, is more violent than in developed societies. An effect, they contend, resulting from institutional justice and mechanisms to minimize bloodshed or revenge cycles. But of course, our development, technology, industrialization, massive nation states, and our ability to coordinate large groups has made modern warfare much more destructive and deadly. We now do it less often, but when we do it, it's a disaster of unimaginable proportions. Peterson and Wrangham focus their attention on the species that we are closest to, chimpanzees and bonobos. These are the best analogs of our genetic heritage and evolutionary development. Chimps and bonobos are very similar species, indistinguishable to most people. Modern analysis has revealed that humans, chimps, and bonobos share 97% of our DNA structure. In terms of genetics, we are close cousins. What's more, in evolutionary terms, human beings are the result of a relatively fast evolutionary process. Our ancestors were walking upright around 5 million years ago. We were relying on more meat and growing larger brains about 2 million years ago. We tamed fire at about 1.5 million years. We learned language somewhere 150,000 or so years ago. And all of our farming and other technology didn't emerge until roughly 10,000 years ago. So while we differ from our cousins in many respects, this huge leap forward only happened recently, and there are a large number of behavioral holdovers. We are more similar species than humans like to admit. Notably, we show many similarities with chimps in the use of aggression and violence. Chimps engage in territorial disputes. These seem to occur as relations between two neighboring communities will deteriorate and members begin to avoid one another. There will be small gangs of chimps patrolling the edges of their territory and sometimes foraying into the other's territory. If during these ventures there's an opportunity to catch a member or a few individuals undefended, the aggressors will attack and beat the vulnerable. These beatings are vicious, often including torture and deliberate disfigurement. Unless the victim can manage to get away, they are murdered in these attacks. Sometimes female chimps and infants will be caught in these raids and likewise be killed. Once the raiding has started, if one community loses and all males are killed, then surviving females will be taken and territory absorbed. There are no lasting peace in these conflicts. Only force parity can ensure the survival of both communities. There is a great deal of excitement during these attacks. This type of raiding is very, very similar to inter-community conflict in human, hunter-gatherer, or other small, underdeveloped communities. There is no immediate material need in these disputes for chimps and often not in human raiding either. It isn't a simple survival competition. Likewise, even within communities, chimps rape. Males dominate and they assault females. And male-chimp competition for hierarchy can result in both violence and in injury. Chimp societies, like most all human societies, are rigidly patriarchal. The extremity of this behavior is not common in the animal kingdom, even if gender domination, territory protection, and mating violence is common. Quote, "Only chimps and humans will deliberately seek to kill and will do so despite the submission and plea for mercy of the victim. Only chimps and humans will seek to mutilate or to torture. In general, the pattern and extent of violence is much more pronounced in apes than in other species." Close quote. Human violence, especially war, is so varied it is difficult to draw a direct correlation between ourselves and chimpanzees. But at a base level, the similarities are striking. In underdeveloped tribal groups, about 30% of human males die from violence. And this statistic is shared by chimps. It isn't that difficult to imagine the chimps starting a war like the one in Ukraine. Of course, without the guns, bombs, and jet fighters. Back when the USSR collapsed, the West entered into an unprecedented dialogue with Russia. At that time, we could have entered into a completely different world. Russia could have been invited into NATO and into the European Union. We could have seen both sides of this current war combining into a structure similar to what has been enacted between the countries of Europe, the Americas, and Australia, New Zealand. After all, we share so many cultural commonalities. It isn't unimaginable. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, we retreated into smaller territories. We reduced the amount of open, trusting interaction. We patrolled our boundaries and we encouraged growing tension and animosity. Both sides chose to display their military prowess and to signal their ability for effective violence. Slowly, inexorably, the raiding and the killing began in Crimea, in Syria, along the edges of territory, or in contested areas. Then the Ukraine conflict began, where Russia, the raiding party in this case, began widespread killing of their weaker neighbors. The only restraint is the restraint being forced with the threat of nuclear holocaust. Chimps are instinctively and aggressively territorial. So are we. Chimps patrol, they raid, and they try to intimidate. So do we. Chimps will attack a weaker party when they can get away with it. Yep, apparently so do Russians. Luckily, we in the civilized democratic West don't do that. Well, unless we ask the Middle Eastern states, the Central Americans, the Iraqis, the Vietnamese, the Afghans. I mean, you get my point. Chimps murder indiscriminately. They use rape and torture as a weapon. Murder when they don't have to. Try to absolutely annihilate their enemies, even a weak one. Yes, and Russians will do all these things in Ukraine. Chimps will back off if they think their enemy can cause them serious retaliatory harm. Otherwise, they will commit atrocities. Sadly, Russia was correct in their assessment that NATO won't intervene directly. Would Europe and her allies turn the tables and kill the aggressive Russians? Would the West bomb Moscow? Would they indiscriminately kill Russian soldiers and accept countless civilian casualties? If they believe they could, without repercussions? Absolutely. Like it or not, it seems pretty clear. We behave like chimpanzees. Sadly, despite our massive libraries full of knowledge, we're still ugly, nasty animals. Chimpanzees with massive brains and nuclear bombs, but still chimpanzees. Now, whoa there, Lefty, I hear my audience cry. How sadly reductionist. What a gross oversimplification. You clearly don't understand the complexity of the geopolitical situation, the incredible pressures of governing a complex state like Russia, the millennia-long history of Eastern Europe, the nefarious effects of Western military-industrial complex, Putin's criminality and psychopathic tendencies. Stripped of this incredible historical, social, and economic background, this wouldn't be happening. Humans may be animals, but our ability to make logical and strategic decisions based on facts makes our modern situation completely different than a group of stupid chimps in the jungle. You're reaching. Peterson and Wrangham back me up. Their argument goes like this. Human beings are intelligence at a level that no animal can match. We're able to logically assess any situation and arrive at solutions that no animal could grasp or imitate. In that respect, we're transcendent. Russia, because of their history, see Ukraine as an extension of Russia. They resent and fear NATO meddling. This is the problem they're trying to solve with the invasion. What drives the solution in particular? Territorial fear and national or personal pride. Exactly the same motivations driving chimps. It used to be thought that animals went to war because of their heart, emotions, and we did because of our heads, thinking. But new evidence suggests that even though we reason more than animals, our essential process for making decisions still relies on emotion. Peterson and Wrangham point out that humans with brain injuries that reduce their capacity for emotion can still effectively reason. Their use of logic remains unaltered. However, while they can reason a list of possibilities, they are incapable of making a choice. Quote, reason generates a list of possibilities. Emotion chooses from that list. Close quote. Yes, our fear of our neighbor is rational. We have reasons to suspect our neighbors of aggression. History provides an endless list of reasons. Of course, it's the simple barbaric Russians using fear as a justification for this invasion. Perhaps us in the democratic and enlightened West are better than the Russians. Maybe we have evolved to the point where we aren't as driven by emotions. Again, Peterson and Wrangham attack such notions. They argue that the base of our aggressive decisions is simple ego. Here, Western democracy is also guilty. We know that Russia is sensitive about Eastern Europe, yet we still meddle. It is probably ego that drove the expansion of NATO to a bigger and more impressive alliance. A more impressive alliance on paper. New nations with less powerful militaries. Nations that needed defense, while not adding new defensive capabilities. Or perhaps the ego of businessmen. Those peddlers of military equipment who knew that the former Soviet nations would have to spend a crap ton of money upgrading and conforming their military to NATO requirements. So we can all see Putin's massive engorged ego on display, but we've also whipped ours out. Neither side in this conflict can complain dispassionate logic. Both must be pitifully consigned to the animal pens. This behavior in chimpanzees, according to Peterson and Wrangham, is typical of a party gang species. A party gang species is a social species that live constantly in groups and develop tight, lasting relationships between members of the group. What differentiates a party gang from other social species is varying group size. Sizes of groups change with the environmental conditions. When resources are scarce, a large band will need to travel farther and work harder to be fed. Large groups will adapt by breaking into smaller groups, conserving the total energy expended in the search, hunt, or gathering of food. If an average animal needs 1 square kilometer of area to find food, then a group of 5 will need 5 kilometers, and so on. A smaller group requires less energy burnt versus the food required. Chimps do exactly this. Groups will grow larger when there is ample fruit and smaller when fruit is harder to find. Humans are similar. Before farming, we lived in small groups. Once we farmed, our communities grew. With modern farming and logistics, we now live in megacities, and so on. In the animal kingdom, party gang species are more likely to kill neighbors than other social species. This behavior is allowed in party gangs because of variable size communities. One community may be smaller and weaker, and therefore they're vulnerable. Likewise, this flexibility facilitates females being integrated into the winning group, sometimes forced, sometimes willingly, but usually the inevitable result of losing the males in their community. Genetic heritage rewards aggressive, violent behavior. This violence in chimps and in humans is usually driven by male aggression. Females are capable of violence, but tend to be smaller and less aggressive. Again, there has been a bit debate about whether human male violence is socially determined or not, but the facts seem quite stark. In almost every society where records of violence exist, 96 to 100% of murders are committed by men. This violence can be reduced or increased by social factors, but perpetrators remain predominantly male. The physiology and genetics of chimpanzees and humans supports this instinctual and practical preference for male domination. In a community of chimps or humans, males cooperate in foraging, often ranging long distances. Females, on the other hand, females with infants in particular, are unable to undertake these long excursions and therefore less consistently able to forage. This foraging behavior offers men a great deal of time together in competitive activity that builds affiliative bonds. Females are more likely to be involved in solitary, child-focused activity and less likely to build strong cooperative bonds. Due to both capabilities and cooperation, males are far more likely to defend territory. When violence is focused domestically on females, their size, isolation, their lack of support disadvantages them, resulting in durable, patriarchal structures. So it would seem, male aggression, violence, and war is inevitable. Our closest relatives and all of our history show pretty convincingly that human beings are patriarchal, territorial, violent, and have always engaged in war. We built political and ethical systems to try and reduce our tendencies, but sadly, we've never been successful. We've applied our huge intelligence trying to be better, but our emotions warp our intelligence and make us only better at killing. The book, Demonic Males, does not stop with this answer. It goes on to throw a huge wrench into these conclusions. That wrench is our other closest relative, the bonobo. The bonobo, a species so close to chimps that no one realized they were even a separate species until the middle of the 20th century. Bonobo behavior is significantly different, building communities that are stable and extremely peaceful. Compared to both chimps and humans, bonobos are pacifists. The critical question here is why? Why the almost identical genetics, almost identical physiology, identical ancestry, similar environment, yet producing a lack of war, raiding, rape, domestic violence, and less violent competition? Peterson and Wrangham describe the few critical differences that drive this miraculous outcome. First, bonobos have completely different power hierarchies with parity between the sexes. A senior female bonobo and a senior male bonobo have the same stature within their communities. This parity is protected through robust female cooperation. Young female bonobos, when they join a new community, will begin to actively court an older female to be their partner. Quote, females seem to build larger affiliative networks, and the females respect their subordinates. For adolescent, the bond with the senior female is the passport to a network of support and security. These cooperative networks offset male size, strength, and aggression. No female could be bullied without allies to help her. While one male could abuse a single female, males cannot stand against a group of females. Bonobos, sometime in the evolutionary past, also developed an ability to eat fibrous foods such as leaves. This adaptation has allowed them to travel less in order to be fed, giving them less need to change group sizes. The benefits are significant, including allowing females to spend more time together, reducing size imbalances between communities. This is the second difference versus chimpanzees and humans. Bonobos are less of a party gang species. The final difference is one which is remarked on constantly. Bonobos appear to be pansexual and have a crap ton of sex. The adolescents who join the older females engage in sex. There is constant heterosexual and homosexual sex. Sex appears to play many, many roles. It's used for reproduction, for alliance building, for reduction of tension, and for simple fun. It is notable that bonobos are also known for being one of the only species, other than humans, that laugh. When two communities meet near their borders, even in a situation of contested resources, there are few violent conflicts. Often two senior females will meet, they'll have sex, and they thereby signal to their communities peace. The other female members of the communities will then intermingle. Male bonobos do not compete for female attention and do not attempt to form exclusive ownership of females. They do not patrol or raid other territories. Female bonobos do not have any outward sign of ovulation, reducing an additional potential for competition. But the frequency and ease of sexual behavior may also play a role. After all, a male doesn't need to compete in order to ensure that his genetic heritage is spread. To summarize, bonobos are different because females cooperate, because they maintain stable communities, because males are not allowed to dominate, and because everyone is allowed to physically love anyone they please in any way they please, and the more often the better. The result of these differences is a society that frankly looks pretty damned attractive. These differences also highlight the core message in the book. Quote, "In countless instances, biologists have watched animals change their behavior to suit their purposes. The whole logic of evolution would indicate that animals use intelligence to serve evolutionarily appropriate goals. Why otherwise would problem solving and learning ever have evolved? These systems have evolved and they are subject in turn to genetic variations. Inherited temperaments in different environments can express all sorts of different behaviors. Even in a single species, we see bursts of creativity and vastly different approaches to solving similar problems. But the underlying psychology remains inescapably subject to evolutionary forces." Close quote. Sure, we human beings are violent, and we have a history of violence that is extreme. But the cynics, the authoritarians, the warmongers, and the average man on the street are wrong when they assert inevitability. If bonobos, a simple animal with a few changes in their society, can achieve peace, then so can we. Peterson and Wrangham don't make many specific recommendations, but they do argue that the liberation and equalization of the genders is a critical factor in peace. They point out how modern democracies have increased female participation in all levels of society, including greater inclusion in governance. These changes have happened along with a slow decline in the level of overall violence in our societies and a reluctance of democratic nations to aggressively start wars. And notice I said reluctance, not inability. On this basis, the authors conclude that our growing use of formal democratic systems and formalized bureaucracies seem to be moving human society in the right direction. They suggest that these tendencies need to continue, and society needs to encourage yet further change. For instance, a tendency for women to be attracted to and compete for aggressive men genetically enhances aggressive traits. Our future may be better if we can shift these behaviors. We need to develop even greater intolerance for male dominance, for militias, and for other groups that build male aggressive alliances. If these aggressive male affiliations become less acceptable in general, and men who join them become less attractive sexually, then these tendencies can be reduced to everyone's benefits. The authors conclude by saying, an aggressive, paternalistic humanity with the capability to destroy itself will. So whether you welcome these changes or not, we still need to make them. I really enjoyed and I learned a huge amount from this book. It helped me to understand the roots of violence and warfare in a much clearer way. But I was disappointed by the author's limited, although responsible, conclusions. They suggested a few obvious changes, but they shied away from some conclusions that might also be drawn. The big one for me is bonobos' attitude to sex. It is obvious that sex competition underlies a history of violence in chimpanzees and in human behavior. Why are males so violent and aggressive? Because it increases their chances of reproduction. Why are males so often driven by ego? Because it supercharges the same aggression. But the bonobo sexual free-for-all is an admirably peaceful one. Wouldn't it follow then that our own relative sexual repression is feeding violence or at least restraining change? Bonobos' use of sex allows them to concretely, physically reassure every member of the community that they are loved, that they're safe, cared for, and then no bonobo will be excluded. Rather than driving jealousy and violence, it drives the opposite. Perhaps we need to consider promiscuity as an ethical personal choice. We've known for some time that homosexuality plays many roles in traditional societies, and there are recent scientific theories that suggest it is a genetically driven response to social conditions. Perhaps this is nature's way of showing us being gay, being bisexual, or simply being a flexible straight is preferable to socially prescribed heterosexuality. Maybe LGBTQ plus liberation is actually human liberation. Perhaps if men were less likely to kick each other's asses and more likely to grab each other's asses, we'd have a better world. Maybe if women were busy flirting with one another rather than competing for the nearest big D knuckle dragger, we would have a less violent world. Maybe if we could get a few Karens laid, they would have less to bitch about. Maybe if more nations were concerned about reducing violence and weapons rather than policing morality, we could live in a safer and more pleasant and less violent world. So how does all of this apply to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Well, Russia is a notably sexist, anti-LGBTQ, encourages macho masculinity, and tolerates aggressive, violent domination or governance, whatever you want to call it. Both sides of this conflict are not free from these traits. The West has not been free of militant posturing, patrolling, or trying to isolate Russia. Alliances like NATO are all about building military power that ensures one side has protection from aggression and a greater ability to use violence when they choose. These tendencies encourage egotistical posturing, territoriality, and they reduce trust. Now, Putin's hurt pride, his nostalgia for the old, powerful USSR, has encouraged his decisions. Putin's hurt ego won't allow him to attack Western Europe or NATO because they can retaliate. But Ukraine is smaller, weaker, and unable to fight back easily. And after all, it's exciting and it feels good to beat on someone, to destroy your enemies, and to use power unilaterally. Being an old man, this isn't about reproduction or sex after all. But that doesn't mean that male aggressive dominating pride isn't guiding Putin's every decision. His member may not get as stiff as it used to, but deep down inside, he's the same dick-waving chimpanzee. Putin is a horrible war criminal. He's a tyrant. But he is also a relatively simple one to understand. There seems to be a lot of media squawk about Putin being unpredictable. But from an evolutionary standpoint, he's completely transparent. Is war inevitable? No, it isn't. War is only inevitable if we don't change. Every standard conservative trope about patriotism, about strength, about competition, about traditional values is one-way street to more violence. Our attempts to circumvent these horrible tragedies through alliances, traditional ritualized diplomacy, and mutual deterrence will fail. The changes we need to make seem to be right here and right now, extremely close to home. We need to look at how we treat one another and figure out how to allow everyone to participate. We need to stop tolerating sexism, homophobia, transphobia, racism, and aggressive win-at-all-cost behavior, regardless of the form. We need to encourage women to work together and to support their increased participation. We need to be very clear that male aggression and domination isn't acceptable. We need to hold men, our friends, our brothers, our sons, and our leaders accountable for coercion, threats, or violence. We need to disavow aggressive male rhetoric. We need to criticize women who act catty and competitive about men. We need to fight internalized sexism with the same intensity we fight sexism aimed at others. And maybe, just maybe, we need to put a little more energy into getting laid. And I don't know about you, but I think this is as good a reason as any to start a revolution. So thanks for watching this video all the way through. My script and citations are linked in the description. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. As always, this is XCG wishing you and your fellow primates a sexy trip down your road to freedom.